Hi, good day to you all. I'm Terri Markham with Uprising, and we are here to do another interview for our It's All Connected series. Today, we're going to be talking about the topic of sex work, and we are going to be interviewing Dr. Angie Henderson of the Avery Center for Research and Services. It's nice to have you here today, Angie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk about this. It doesn't get talked about enough.
Awesome. And we are joined by a second guest today as well. To help me interview Angie, we have, she's now known as the Laughing Survivor, Alexandra Ford. And before she became known as the Laughing Survivor, she actually helped to co-found Uprising. So I'm really excited to have Alexandra back with me.
I'm excited to be able to work with you again, Terri. And
Awesome.
Definitely excited to be able to talk to you, Angie, and talk about your research.
Sweet. I love it when nerds want to listen to me talk about research.
All right.
Definitely nerds over here.
Before we get into the actual interview, first I'm going to pass things over to Alexandra because I thought you could share a little bit about the background conversations that you and I have had that led to us reaching out to Angie to have this conversation.
Absolutely. So I found it really interesting. Like Terri said, I co-founded Uprising in Wyoming, and then I ended up moving home to Canada, specifically British Columbia. And I kept doing the work here in British Columbia, and I found a lot of the work is really similar, but there are some glaring differences. But even with these glaring differences, the same questions keep coming up. So I called Terri up one day and I said, hey, when you have a minute, I really want to talk to you about what your stance is or what your answer is when you get asked a question. So we set up a time and we were talking, and I said, what do you say when people ask you, is sex work real work? You know, what about the rights of the sex workers? What about that side of things? And frankly, I thought, coming from Terri, coming from Wyoming, that wasn't a question she was going to be asked a whole bunch. Wyoming is really conservative. We really didn't have to, when we started Uprising, we really didn't have to convince people that prostitution was harmful, and we just really had to tell people, like, it does happen here. But once they understood that, they were willing to work with us to make to help communities be safer against it. In British Columbia, it's a bit of a different story. And across Canada, we have the PSEPA law, which is the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. This was, I believe, instated in 2014, and it basically follows the Nordic model or the equality model. When it was instated, they said after 5 years, it would have to be given a review. We are now past that 5-year review time, and there is a lot of noise from the pro-sex work people who are saying sex work is real work. This law makes our lives more dangerous, our lives more difficult, and we want it repealed. Which to me was really shocking, because a lot of us who work in the anti-human trafficking industry really look to the equality or Nordic models as kind of the go-to of how to keep people safe, because they work on that supply and demand issue, really trying to reduce demand by criminalizing the purchasing of sex. So when I asked Terri, like, hey, are you hearing this? And she was hearing it as well. We said, well, this is coming from basically two ends of the spectrum, but the same conversation is happening. So we need to talk to someone who is doing research in this field and who can talk to us about how best to answer that question and look at it from both sides and provide us with as much information as possible. So Terri suggested you, Angie, and that's where we really want to lead off, is that initial question: is sex work real work?
That is a great question. And as somebody whose day job is in academia, my day job is I'm a professor in a sociology department at the University of Northern Colorado. I will say that I am considered, since I support the equality model, I'm considered a really odd duck. I think I would be for a variety of personal reasons, but professionally, they think it's so bizarre. Colleagues who are professors and even student groups on campus, they just don't get it in the same way that I do. But I think that makes sense because they haven't interviewed over 75 victims and survivors like I have. They also haven't interviewed buyers to the extent that I have. The only piece of that triangle that I haven't dug into in depth one-on-one is with traffickers. But as a sociologist, I have to back all the way up and understand like the social ecological model in order to even start to begin to make sense of what drives this industry. And just like any industry, demand drives supply, right? And so when I think about answering that question, is sex work work? My answer is no, it's inherently exploitative. It would be akin, and the way that I describe this in my sociology of sex trafficking and sex work class, and yes, I had to add that and sex work to my syllabus and to my course, otherwise they wouldn't let me teach the class.
Really? Wow.
Yep. But when I talk about it in that way, I'm like, imagine if I set up shop at the St. Michael's community in Greeley, and you could show up and you could pay $100 to just punch somebody straight for an hour. Is that a human rights violation? That's a real person that has consented to be punched for an hour. And my students are like, whoa, no. I'm like, okay, here, we're on the same wavelength here, right? So there's that piece, that anecdotal piece that I use to sort of drive that example home to my students, but then also thinking about just from a very macro level perspective, if demand drives supply, we know based on research that in countries where it's been legalized or decriminalized, demand has increased, it's skyrocketed. This is why people erroneously go to Vegas and think that they're gonna be able to pay prostituted people all the time for all the sex. They don't understand it's not actually legal in Las Vegas. It's in a couple of counties in Nevada. But where it's legal or where it's decriminalized, demand skyrockets. We know this based on a variety of different research studies, both cross-culturally, around the world, and then also studies with buyers, men who have said, if this was against, it is against law, but if police were to target sex buyers more, they would stop. They don't want to get arrested. So we can end exploitation very simply by practicing the equality model. And no, I don't think it's work. Do I think that there are people who operate as individual independent escorts? Yes. Is it possible that they don't ever experience exploitation? That's iffy because, and the reason I say that is the interviews that I've done with victims and survivors and a handful of people who identified at the time of interview as sex workers, they all had experienced violence. Every single one of them had experienced violence at the hands of a buyer. Every single one. Not one person that I interviewed said that it was completely 100% their choice and they felt completely independent to leave at any moment. When you're prevented from leaving a job, I don't know any other job where you have to have an exit strategy, where you have to have services for that person to heal when they leave. If I retire from being a professor, I don't get a bunch of free therapy to have to deal with all the trauma that I endured in my 30 years as being a professor. Like that, looking at it from that perspective, it's not working the same way that any other job is, not even close.
So are there any?
No, definitely.
I'm just curious, like, with this like full decrim model that is in some places, are there any benefits like that you know of?
To traffickers, yes, absolutely. Yes. And to buyers, absolutely. To victims and sex workers, no. And what's interesting about British Columbia and even in parts of Europe, that it's interesting thinking about the entire anti-trafficking movement and the pro-sex work movement in the United States versus in Canada or in parts of Europe, just as one example. First of all, it's my understanding based on the survivors that I interviewed in Canada, they don't use the word survivor because it's like, what did you survive? It's a job. You didn't I'm not a professorial survivor once I quit doing my job, right? And so if it's considered a legitimate form of work, what have you survived, right? Mm-hmm. So thinking about the demographic of survivors in the United States, the majority of people who are exploited in sex trafficking situations in the US are US citizens. So they look like me, they look like women of color, they look like, just a demographic of the United States. Is there an overrepresentation of people of color from minoritized backgrounds? Absolutely. But in Europe, they're immigrant women and children and boys and men and individuals. So it's interesting getting folks in those sorts of places to care as much because of the discrimination against immigration just in general. So to get them to think about caring about immigrant women's healing and rights, human rights, it's a completely different story. That's why the survivor movement in the US is so huge, and it's not in a lot of other places, because it's hard to get folks to care about minoritized bodies and people. Super interesting.
In Canada, we certainly, I wish I had the exact stats, but I believe the percentage of the trafficked population is something like 50% Indigenous women and girls. And they're 3% or something of Canada's overall population, which is, you know, again, it has that Canada right now is coming to a reckoning with its Indigenous population, one that is long overdue. And that I what you just said rings true. I think that's a lot of people's reaction is they're not, certainly not immigrants, but there's still that like,
Others.
I don't care. Yeah, they're not me, which is part of the reason as a survivor myself, I speak out, because not that I think my voice should be any louder or heard anymore, but if I can get someone to care that should be caring anyway, and for whatever reason, I register with them because I look like their daughter or the kids that their kids go to school with or something, then great. We have another body on board who is saying, hey, this needs to be stopped.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and that's exactly what needs to be done in those spaces, 100%. Yep.
Yeah, definitely need to up the care.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I don't know, I can't speak to Canada, but in the US, what I see as a non-researcher, just, you know, everyday person out in the field, I feel like we have this thing where the pendulum swings too far, or either way too far to one side or way too far to the other. And right now, like under the current administration and just the climate of things, it feels like the pro-sex work is also really tied up in this like feminism and it's my body, my choice.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you address this from that lens where people are like, no, it's my body, I get to pick, and this is what I want to do, or whatever?
Great question.
Be called anti-feminist if you're against sex work. That's
yeah. And so in my classes, I teach 2 classes that are related: sociology of sex trafficking and sex work, and then global perspectives of prostitution. And in those classes, many of the students come, I mean, again, they're between the ages of 18 and 22. The vast majority of them come to class as liberal feminists, which that's the version of feminism that's like, my body, my choice. Let me do what I want with my body. By the end of class, I've exposed them to original writings by survivors. They read so much survivor literature. I assign like every survivor autobiography or book that's ever been written. They read it. And they watch World Without Exploitation webinars, and they listen to survivors. They watch an interview that I did with Andrea Hines, who's Canadian. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, Alexandra. She's amazing. And so once they stop and listen, I mean, it isn't that really the lesson for everybody? Like if you've got 2 sides of an issue, the best thing you can do is to listen to the other side. And what's fascinating about the anti-trafficking space, which is where we would find radical feminists, which is individuals who believe like the patriarchy is everywhere and that's what needs to be disrupted. And then liberal feminists on the pro-sex work side, we actually agree on a lot. We don't want people to be exploited and harmed. What's missing from that conversation is what this is doing to our culture and what it's reproducing on a cultural level. If men are socialized and taught that they can purchase access to a woman's body, they can pay somebody to rape them, that's what radical feminists are real upset about, right? And we agree on that harms piece. And I think a lot of individuals that I interviewed have similar thoughts. Many of the survivors and victims said that they have compassion for the buyers and there's something missing in their lives that they wish that they could get fixed somewhere else. But they purchase sex because it's a quick fix. And then it starts a cycle of shame that just repeats itself and repeats itself and repeats itself. And one thing we know about shame, and I'm not a shame researcher, but I'm the president of the Brene Brown fan club. Shame is just destructive, and pornography addiction and sex buying escalates as a sex crime. It just escalates and it gets worse and more violent over time. And so for me, when people say, what do you do with those two sides of the debates? I always say, listen to survivors, listen to people who have been involved in the work. That's the most important thing you can do when talking about any issue.
Absolutely.
One thing Alexandra and I have talked about, and you will know far more on this topic than we do, because I have actually learned about this from the Avery Center, but this, a lot of the voices in the pro-sex movement, a lot of them are like current sex workers. And I know in the anti-trafficking field, we're now learning, thanks in part to the Avery Center, a lot about this idea of like cultic theory and people not maybe recognizing the harm when they're in it. So
Absolutely.
Do you think that's a contributing factor to this?
100%. How much time do we have?
I know.
So Megan Lundstrom is the co-founder and director of research at the Avery Center for Research and Services, and she also identifies as a sex trafficking survivor. When she first started exiting and started explaining, like early on after she was exiting, so during her healing, an early healing journey, she was trying to explain to people what had happened. And one of the people she had lunch with asked to hear her whole story, which is problematic in and of itself. But after Megan shared her story, the woman said, oh, well, I'm really glad you started making better choices. And so Megan was like, that's not really, it wasn't about my choices. So she started researching herself the characteristics of cultic theory. And of all 15 characteristics of cultic theory, domestic pimp-controlled sex trafficking meets every single one. So we've been working on this project, and that's part of the reason I've interviewed so many victims and survivors, is to gather data to support that hypothesis that Megan had set out. And we have overwhelming data to support that hypothesis, that there's a lot of brainwashing. And when you're being gaslit and you have a trauma bond with somebody, you're going to believe things about yourself that are just not based in reality, right? So a lot of the survivors and victims I interviewed said the first time they turned their first trick, or the first time they were forced to do their first commercial sex act, they immediately were like, okay, this is all I'm good at. And their pimp or trafficker just reinforced that idea in their heads. He also told them never to trust anybody outside of the cult, outside of the sex trafficking operation. And so you begin to start to think these things about yourself. This is what I'm good at. I enjoy it. And so there's that brainwashing piece. There's also this other model, this other theoretical model that I think is so important. And Andrea Hines touched a little bit on it in her 2020 publication in Dignity. It's called life course theory. So looking at the life course of somebody involved in the commercial sex trade as a provider, as a prostituted person. Over the course of their time in the commercial sex trade, they're going to identify as a sex worker, or identify as what Megan has said and what Rebecca Bender has even said. I identified as a hoe, right? Not my words, their words. And then once you're removed from that trauma, your brain is able to fully look back and go, wait a minute, that was all force, fraud, and coercion. Of course, it doesn't come up in those terms. And it's never as clean and neat or as quick as it should be, but that's how the brain works. Once you're exited and you're healing, you can start to look back and go, wait a minute, no, I'm not a sex worker. That was not empowering at all. Some recent research we actually just got done talking about yesterday. We looked at different types of trafficking, and among people who had experienced pimp control trafficking and familial trafficking, they all had, not familial, but pimp controlled trafficking, they had a lifelong aversion to sex. And this finding is huge. The reason it's huge is because you hear from the pro-sex work lobby that it's empowering. I'm taking back control of my life. I'm taking back control of, the sexual abuse that I experienced as a child, as one example. But the result in reality is a lifelong aversion to sex. So there's no way that claim is true. Absolutely no way.
You hit on something there that was 100% correct for me. When I got involved, I walked into it with eyes open, as I thought at the time. And a lot of it for me, I was sexually assaulted as a child. And so a lot of it for me was like, well, if this was taken from me, then it's empowering to me if I get to be in control, and why not make money from this? And so in my situation, I thought I was helping a boyfriend, steal or make money or distract or whatever. But at that time, if anybody had asked me, it would have been, yeah, how much money do you make? Like, what do you do? I look good. I would have blown that off. With a little bit of insight, at that time, probably could have gone to that place of saying, this is about taking control of my body. My autonomy and my body was taken away from me. So I'm taking my control back. Again, speaking from a place of perceived empowerment. And then, with my situation, as soon as I realized, like, I'm not in control of this at all. Once again, someone else is controlling me and I want out. Out was not an option. But still, when I knew that, my friends who approached me and are like, really? You're going to take up stripping now? Like, are we making good choices, Alexandra? And I knew at that time, I don't want to do this. I'm terrified, but no is not an option. So what came out of my mouth was, I like this. I'm having fun. I get to party for work, all of those things. I think one of the sentences that I can't remember where I heard it now, but if someone had asked me at the time, who keeps the money? That simple sentence might have set off a light bulb, maybe one that I chose to ignore for a while, but it would have registered and taken root eventually. And when I got out, and I was not in for very long, it was a short, horrible time in my life. And I'm still healing from that. And that was in 2007. And absolutely, there's no way to have a completely normal sexual relationship after that. Once sex is something you can purchase, you can sell, it's something that someone else has controlled your body, you never really get back into that place of comfort, regardless of what age you walked into it. And I think, or was forced into it or got into it, whatever way you did. And it's those repercussions of specifically the sex industry that interest me so much, because a lot of the research, I love that you're doing that research, because a lot of research that's done right now is, yes, people have trauma after like being prostituted or working in the industry, but we don't really know if it started before or during. So we'll just say they're traumatized, and we can't really speak to if this was the cause or if they went into it traumatized. And I think that bit of data there is so crucial to speak to the pro sex work industry of, regardless of where you were beforehand and whether you went into it with open eyes, you think, or for whatever reason, however you got there, you don't come out unscathed.
No,
nobody just don't.
Nobody does.
So how, and like you said at the beginning, how do you promote a job to someone that says, you're going to go into this, you're going to party, you're going to have fun, it's empowering. Afterwards, you'll need 10 to 15 years of trauma therapy. Right. And you may never have a normal relationship again, right. Or what will be normal to you will take a lot of work every single day to get there. But this will be fun. Don't worry, it's empowering. Like, you have to love this. That's, I think, where you have this message that's just getting so twisted up in there. Mm-hmm. And again, what I say when I want to speak to the pro sex work people here in Canada is, even if, and you spoke to this briefly, are there people who are in there and genuinely enjoy it? Possibly, sure, maybe. Even if there are, it's a small percentage, a very tiny percentage. And in Canada, in the States, countries don't make laws to protect the small group that are A-OK and don't need help. They make laws to protect the vulnerable.
Right.
And
they shouldn't make laws to protect the privileged.
Yes, they shouldn't. and that's the struggle.
Yeah, that's the thing. And there's this, I'm not sure if she would identify as a sex trafficking survivor, so I don't want to misidentify her. But it's a powerful influencer on Instagram. Her name is Romina, and she's been exited, I believe, from the industry for about 3 years. And she posted, so I follow her, Megan and her are good buddies. She posted either yesterday or this morning, the sex work lobby serves, enjoying sex work is for the privileged. Right? I mean, it's it's not something that all people who are involved in the sex trade enjoy. It's the privileged voice is what's carrying that pro-sex work lobby and that pro-sex movement. It's not the marginalized at all. And when it is, if you think about it, if they are saying that, you have to take into account life course theory. You have to.
Mm-hmm.
So at that moment, they're saying, yeah, I'm reclaiming, that feels powerful. That feels amazing. Yeah, I'm reclaiming my sexuality. I was raped or abused as a kid. But then in reality, those years of trauma while you're in the commercial sex trade, that doesn't just dissipate. Like there's no empowering away trauma. You can't empower away trauma. It's not possible.
Yeah, that's really true.
What about you? As you guys are talking, I'm like jotting down notes. Let's talk for a second about the money side compared to sex work, because one thing we noticed, especially over COVID, we have all these people who had lost jobs and they're like, hey, this is great. I can hop on OnlyFans and I'm making bank by participating in sex work. What about that?
I saw that a lot with my students, not with, I don't think traditional sex work, but when the lockdown happened and restaurants closed, many of my students started engaging in online, what I think we would refer to as online sex work. So they opened up an OnlyFans account, or they started a seeking arrangements account, and they tried to find themselves income in those ways. So trying to find a sugar daddy or selling provocative photos or videos of themselves on those sites. And, it's interesting because OnlyFans as a platform, in case people who are watching aren't familiar, OnlyFans is essentially like Instagram, but monetizing it. So you can post pictures of your naked body and people subscribe and they pay for it, right? So it's monetizing your social media essentially with provocative images and videos. It's been around since 2016, but it took off when the lockdown happened. And so it's difficult to make clear causal statements between then and now because it hasn't quite been long enough. But what I do know is people are really interested in OnlyFans. We've done some initial research on it to show that there are several pimps who moved their victims to OnlyFans and they kept taking the money, which makes sense. That's what pimps and traffickers do. And some pimps we follow on social media actually posted their monthly statement from OnlyFans. They're making $40,000 a month from posting their victims on OnlyFans. So we saw that. We also saw people engaging in this commercial sex trade that would have never before engaged. My students would never, I don't think, have become sex workers just because of the economy and because of COVID. But to me, the most troubling piece, and I think the piece we do not talk about enough, is OnlyFans and seeking arrangements brings an entire new type of buyer to the market that would have never engaged in the commercial sex trade at all. So my son is 16 today, actually, and then I have a 13-year-old son. They know what OnlyFans is. We know that pornography addiction precludes sex buying. 100% of sex buyers have a pornography addiction. And I'm a scientist and I'm objective, but I can say confidently 100% with that. There is no variation, every single one of them. And pornography, OnlyFans is getting like sort of specialized content tailored to whatever you request or ask for and you pay for it. The leap from paying for that sexualized, specific tailored content to sex buying, that is like a tiny step. So the thing that worries me the most about that piece is, yes, it's increasing victimization. Yes, traffickers are profiting off of it, but it is expanding the demand. And we haven't even begun to think about what the ramifications of that are. Like in 5 years, all of those OnlyFans subscribers, my son's age now, they could potentially very easily become sex buyers. And where there's demand,
building a bridge.
It's a tiny step from being an OnlyFans subscriber and a porn addict to buying sex. Bringing a whole new
Whereas
level.
Before you're going from porn and have that like distance of they're on a screen, they're actors, you can tell themselves, you tell yourself they like it, whatever. I'd never do that in real life. I'd never meet someone in real life or pay for sex in real life. And now you've created this bridge that is like, well, hey, if you wanted to test out the waters, you can do that here. Once you get comfortable here, you don't even need to take a deep breath before you're,
Tiny step. And so many of the online escort ads that we've been looking at in the past month have their OnlyFans link in their advertisement. So we're able to go and look at the content on OnlyFans and see, like, some of them, before they even have an appointment with a buyer, will say, you have to subscribe to my OnlyFans. So, I mean,
Wow.
It's all linked. It's all connected, right, Terry?
Yes. Yes. So to me, like, even if we do have those few people who are like, I needed to make money, I am willingly choosing to do this, or they really enjoy it, like that tiny percentage of people who have choice in the matter, they're contributing to this giant thing that we don't even know the depth of yet. Mm-hmm. So is it worth it, is what I ask myself.
The cultural repercussions are there. I'm terrified of what the commercial sex trade is going to look like in 5-10 years because of OnlyFans and seeking arrangements, bringing this whole new group of buyers to the market that would have never probably engaged. I mean, we know that on average, 6% of men buy sex in a year? That statistic is going to change, I think, significantly in the next 10 years.
No,
that's scary.
No, that's insane.
Mm-hmm. And we don't talk
about
buyers in demand and men and boys as a way to solve this problem. We just don't.
No, I was actually just going to comment on that. I find it really interesting. You mentioned earlier, some of the survivors you've talked to talk about feeling compassion for the buyers and knowing that they're missing something in their life. There's some sort of connection there. I've talked to someone who had that OnlyFans account, and like, I really enjoyed, the people I talked to. I only talked to people who respected me, and I made friends with them. And so again, you're looking at that piece of connection that's missing. So if you go down in the root system of all of this, it's about connection. It's about, I will say, the patriarchy, and about the idea that we're not teaching our boys and men how to seek genuine connection that they need to feel fulfilled, to feel soulful, to feel whole. And we're actually teaching them from a really young age to quash that part of them. However, that is a real part of every human being, man, woman, child. And you can squish it as much as you want, but all it does is create a gaping hole. So what happens is you have boys and men who are looking for connection, and that can turn into fighting, because that's the only type of connection they get, even physical connection. Who cares if it's a fist to the face? It's physical connection. It can look like, I need an emotional connection because I've never been taught how to do that, or how to seek that, or how to have a healthy version of that. So I'm going to, subscribe to an OnlyFans account or seek out a prostituted person. It can, sexual connection, not learning how to have that in a way that is healthy and sustainable. All of this really comes down to that issue. And yet still so many programs, prevention programs or everything is still so focused on women and girls. And, a lot of people in the industry, we use the term, we know it's a gendered issue when we're talking about the victimization. We know men and boys are victims and survivors, but when we make it a women and girls issue, we're leaving out a huge part of this issue, which is what is the driving force of it. So we can keep teaching women and girls, don't get trafficked, don't make these choices, or don't allow this to happen, or don't get forced into this, or whatever it is. Here, be smarter, be stronger, be whatever. We're not going to erase it from existence, until we start working on helping men and boys deal with their need for healthy connection and teach them how to seek that.
Right, exactly. And Terri
got so good. I'm
in Wyoming with 4 buyers that I interviewed.
Yep. I was just going to bring it up.
Yeah, go ahead, Terri. What did you see? What did you hear?
No, you. I was going to say the same thing. We did a sting operation in Wyoming back in April, and we arrested 4 buyers, and they all 4 consented to doing an interview with Angie and Megan at the time of arrest. And I'll let you share, but I think every single one was clearly looking for that connection piece.
Oh, 100%. And the small sample size, right? It's only 4. But of the buyers that I've also witnessed in John's School, because I've done evaluations for about 5 years of our local John School, it's called the First Offender Restoration Initiative, and it really is about restoration. The way that they do it in Fort Collins is phenomenal. But I wasn't terribly surprised by the answers. I said, so what brought you here today? And we drilled down a little bit, and all of it was loneliness. One of the guys admitted to having ED, erectile dysfunction, which I know based on the research usually comes from a porn addiction, and then wanting to solve that problem by seeing if they can perform in person with a prostituted person. It's all about that shame cycle. Every piece of it is about shame. And that was really impactful. So I interviewed these guys in a room full of law enforcement, and the law enforcement, they were absolutely wonderful to work with that whole week. They were so great. And they definitely, some of them still had that mindset of, you're a criminal, I'm going to put you in jail, and your rights don't matter, and your heart doesn't matter, and whatever. And at the end of the op and the debrief, the police officers, law enforcement folks were like, this changed the way that I think about humans that I arrest completely. And one of the buyers actually went back to the sheriff's office the next week. One of the buyers, he was arrested, spent time in jail, went back on Monday and told the sergeant, I did what that lady said. I did the research on what sex trafficking is, and I'd like to follow up with her and that other lady. I'm always referred to as the other lady, in 6 months. And so to me, that's what it's about. It's about that piece of that equation. Yes, we need victims to heal. We need to prevent this from happening in the first place. But an easy way to prevent it happening from the first place is to just stop the demand. It's pretty simple. Basic economics, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's crazy how everything is just so, it is connected.
Yes.
And you're not the other lady. You're the lady. You're both the lady. Trust me.
I'm going to get a shirt that says "the" in big, and the lady.
Any other questions, Alexandra? This was amazing.
I'm pretty sure I could sit and ask questions and continue this conversation for the rest of the day, because I find it so fascinating, everything that you have to say as someone in who has spent far too many years in the academic world and loves to talk about data and sample sizes and all of this sort of thing. I am fascinated, and like I said, can pick your brain for hours. But also, I really appreciate how you approach this question, this is sex work real work question, from a place of data, science, and survivorship. That to have all of that, I think, is so critical. And the more I think about it, like, that is such a critical piece. And then the other side of this is talking to men and boys, and talking to them not about don't get trafficked, not about don't buy people, or not just about don't buy people, but also don't be traffickers. That's a piece that we don't, the traffickers are just, they're villainized for a reason.
Yeah.
But they were a child, they were someone at one point too. How did the road take them to a point where this was okay?
Yeah.
And how do we continue to, or how do we not continue to exploit that idea that they are heartless, soulless individuals? Some I'm sure are, but also, how did they get there? Because if we don't know that life path, how do we put a stop to it?
Yeah.
If we don't know the life path of a buyer, how do we put a stop to it? It all comes down to prevention, which is why I know Terri, and I'm sure you are so passionate about prevention. There's so much care needed, absolutely, for survivors, for people exiting, for people who want to exit the other side of the life as well. But until we start talking about the root causes of all of this and work there, it's a snowball that's out of control. We're not going to get control of it. So
yeah, and one way to think about traffickers is, they absolutely, there's a whole story that needs to be told about traffickers and how they journey into this. And if there's no demand, traffickers won't traffic people. They'll continue to traffic drugs, which Not great, but at least it's not human beings. I mean, in the United
Yeah.
States, the maximum penalty, federal penalty for trafficking humans is 1 million. For drugs, it's 10 million. We need to increase the cost of risk significantly in this country and probably everywhere, to be honest. So yeah, that journey is super important. And even by just addressing demand, if we get rid of demand or make it to where it's not profitable for traffickers, maybe they'll go on to traffic things that are not human beings, ideally.
Yeah, definitely.
Just a start.
So I'm,
Oh,
go ahead, Terri.
I don't know if you're going to bring up the same thing I was going to bring up, but as you were just talking, all I can think of, I've just been reading the Oprah Dr. Perry book. And so it's like, instead of asking like, what's going on? Why are you doing this? It's looking
What's
at the
wrong with
question
you?
of what happened to you
Story.
that led you here, and taking a look at what's behind the curtain, so to speak.
That's
Yeah,
a question for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, definitely. And I think that's, I just, as you're saying that, I'm picturing like if I was in front of a group of pro sex work individuals, how would I feel about asking that question? What happened to you? Because I think that would be a difficult, you have a group of people who I dare say have built up this wall of empowerment of, and to say what happened to you is to kind of start picking at that wall and say, I'm not saying you're not strong. I'm saying it's okay if you were ever victimized, if you ever felt weakness, if you ever needed help, and to say what happened to you. Things are allowed to have happened to you. And I think that idea of having to quash that is huge. And that leads me on to a whole other diatribe about the use of the words victim and survivor, and why we're so terrified of the word victim when it is what a lot of us are. We were victims. And why is that a shameful thing to admit? Why do we now have to use the word survivor, or then people use thriver, or all these other words to say you were victimized? And that's okay. That doesn't make you, that shouldn't fill you with shame.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I like the phrase, what happened to you, but one I like even more is, what's your story?
Mm-hmm.
What brought you here? Man, and it's just about listening. What brought you here? And what's interesting is, even if you because I guarantee you traffickers have never asked their victims that question. Buyers don't ask sex workers that question. I think this fly is in the pro sex work lobby and trying to but just listening, right? I mean, what's your story? Because in that narrative, as a researcher and somebody who's interviewed 75 individuals who have been in the commercial sex trade, you'd be surprised at what comes out of their mouth. Because this is what happens in therapy. If you provide space for somebody to talk, they'll start to talk, and those words and those things that are stored in their memory will come out, and they'll have realizations. And that can happen without talking, but it happens a lot quicker when you're talking. Putting words to those things to get them out of your head. So what's your story can be a really powerful question for people on the pro sex work side. So I would just encourage people who are listening, like, let's not demonize that side, because everybody has a reason they're doing what they're doing, and they're passionate about what they're doing. And this is a snapshot of where they are, right? If they're engaging in the commercial sex trade, this is where they are. And listen, but also provide space for them to tell more. And listen for the important hinge point moments. And then you can bring in the theoretical model, stages of change. We all start pre-contemplation, which is where nothing's wrong. I don't need to change anything. But even if you can get them just a little bit towards contemplation, you're making progress. And you're listening, which is all I think we're intended to do on this earth as human beings. Just listen to one another.
Absolutely. Share stories, listen, connect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, open your mind.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Awesome. This was great. Thank you so much for chatting with us today, Angie. I want to plug the Avery Center for a second. You guys do amazing work. You're doing great work in the field of research, which is really hard in the anti-trafficking field, because most research comes like after the fact, after people have exited. And I know you guys work with people who are even still in the life. So that's amazing. So tell us a little bit where people can go, because you do all kinds of training that people can request from the Avery Center. I know you've just launched Avery Analytics, so give us some shameless plugs before we go.
Shameless plug. Here's my shameless plug. Research is important and should inform everything. It should inform policy, training, services. Research is listening, and we shouldn't be making decisions about people without having listened to them. So that's what we do at the Avery Center. We're the Avery Center for Research and Services. Research is my thing because I'm a trained nerd. I have a PhD in nerddom. And the services piece is we employ and do job training and psychoeducational support for victims and survivors. I think in 2020, 18 of our employees were survivors, which just makes my heart sing. And the rest of us are just called squares. Who volunteer and show up and do, what we need to do. So everything that we do on the service side of the organization and the trainings and all of the policy consultation that we do is informed by the research that we do. And what we found in our organization is, for the majority of survivors, research is me search. So learning about what happened and learning about experiences helps them heal. So that's really what we're passionate about. Our mission statement is lived experience must inform change. So that's why we blended the two, the research and the services, because together they are a pretty powerful thing. And that's what we're here for.
Awesome.
I will actually add a quick plug for the Avery Center. And what you brought up earlier, Terri, with the cultic theory is, Megan, we're going to be doing a cultic theory. Megan's going to be doing a cultic theory presentation. So if anybody here is interested in learning more about that, then reach out to Terri, if that's okay, with you, Terri, and we can talk about that and you can learn more about that cultic theory. I am so excited for that presentation. I can't wait. I am going to be, taking all of the notes, and I don't know whether I can write or type faster, but I'll be doing both, because I think that is just something that is a way for people to consider it that has not been considered before, but one of those things that it's not new information. Once you start hearing it, you're like, of course, why was this, how is this, shouldn't be new. This is something we should all know. Mm-hmm. So yes, I will plug that because that is going to be so critical. I think such critical learning.
Mm-hmm. And so healing to be like, wow, I'm not crazy. Okay.
Yes, exactly.
Yep. That makes sense. Considered that side.
Yeah.
I don't know. My mind is frequently blown by any time I'm around or have conversations with the Avery Center. So I'm just used to it at this point. But I'm like, all right, what are they going to teach me today? That's going to blow my mind.
I love it.
All right. Well, you guys have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you guys on the next one.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Bye. Thank you.